Hi, everybody. My name's Ganesh Taylor, as has been mentioned, and we are here today to talk about Lost in the Matrix. Until recently, the possibility that we're living in a computer simulation was largely limited to fans of The Matrix, a bit like myself. But some scientists and philosophers are taking seriously the claim that strange quirks of the universe and the black hole information paradox are evidence that our reality is actually a created simulation. Even Elon Musk has come out supporting the theory, arguing that we are most likely in a simulation. Is the idea that we are living in a computer simulation a real possibility? Or is this a sign that we can all be victims to a Hollywood fantasy? Then again, is this simply a new version of the philosophical question made famous by Descartes, can we be sure that reality is not a dream? And if so, why is it so persistent? So, to our speakers. On my left, Anders Sandberg is a researcher, a popular science debater, and a transhumanist. He holds a PhD in computational neuroscience from the University of Stockholm. Sabine Hossenfelder, to my far right, is a theoretical physicist who is also author of Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray. Anil Seth, just immediately to my right here, is a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience. He is a co-director of the Sackler Center for Consciousness Science and editor-in-chief of Neuroscience in Consciousness. To my far left is Massimo Pigliucci, a philosophy professor at the City College of New York and former co-host of the Rationally Speaking podcast. What an illustrious panel. So, with no further ado, what happens now is I'm going to throw out a question, and each of you get 3 minutes and 3 minutes alone to answer the question. The question is the following. Is the idea that we are living in a computer simulation a real possibility? Anders, you're up.
Okay. I started out as a computational neuroscientist, and then I ended up in the philosophy department in Oxford at the Future of Humanity Institute. And my boss, Nick Bostrom, wrote the paper about the simulation argument. So just quickly outline it. He argues that if we survive and get our act together as a species, we're going to develop in an advanced post-human civilization with enormous computing power. And at least some of that is going to be used to run simulations of our past because of entertainment, historical dramas, or figuring out what really happened in those important years in the early 21st century. And of course, that's going to be a lot of simulations. So hence, it seems like if you're a mind in the early 21st century, you might actually more likely be one of the simulated minds rather than one of the few minds that exist in the real world. So his paper ends up with a trilemma. We have to believe in at least one really annoying or crazy thing. Either that we will never reach this post-human state, that we will go extinct because of some global disaster, or that post-humans never do these simulations, either because it's impossible to actually do, or because we're all deciding, oh, that would be totally unethical, subjecting people to the world of 2021. No, that's not ethical, not even to simulated people. Or the third possibility, we're actually happily simulated. He doesn't give a probability, really. Maybe you can say that it's give equal chances, but we really don't have any way of telling. Do I believe that we're simulated? As we will probably get to, I think that it doesn't matter. But the trilemma is important. It's important that we might actually have to think that our world is much weirder than we normally think makes sense.
Fascinating. Sabine, what do you think?
So I'm a theoretical physicist, and I spend my day-to-day life trying to figure out how the fundamental laws of nature work. And whenever I hear about the computer simulation, I get a little bit offended that you get all these philosopher types who make big statements about how the laws of nature work, but never seem to actually bother to look at how they actually do work. So when it comes to the question, do we live in a computer simulation, there's the obvious thing to say, it all depends on what you mean by computer simulation. If you just mean, does the universe in some way calculate the laws of nature, I think, and I guess most physicists would agree with me, the answer is yes, because all our fundamental theories are mathematical in nature, and that's really the only thing that this statement says. But normally, what people have in mind when they talk about the simulation hypothesis is that it's actually some kind of computer that works pretty much the same way that our current computers work, that calculate the laws on a step-by-step basis. And of course, the important question is who programmed it. So that's always the big overarching question. And now, if you look at the question like, could it be that the universe is created by a program running on a computer of the type that we know? The answer is no, because the fundamental laws of nature that we have so far are not of that algorithmic type that proceeds step by step. And this causes a problem because, strictly speaking, if you're trying to make predictions for what people should see in such a simulation, it just doesn't agree with what we actually observe. And there are some people who have looked for it. There should be subtle violations of certain symmetries, for example, and it's just incompatible with observations.
Very clear. Thank you very much. I mean, Anil, where are you going to take this?
Well, I don't like the simulation argument, but that's not in itself a good reason to dismiss it, although it's pretty good. The reasons I dismiss it, firstly, I think, so this question, what's the question we started with? It's, is there a real possibility that we are... I think this is, with apologies to the organisers, a slightly badly put question. It's very difficult to exclude everything completely. For me, it's like, what credence should we assign that kind of that possibility? And I think it's very low. I think the simulation argument that Anders beautifully summarized is really weak in a couple of ways. Firstly, it asks us to assign probabilities to things that we have really no idea how to assign probabilities to. What would our far distant ancestors feel like doing with some extrapolation of the kinds of technology that we have today? To Sabine's point, people have an idea of what a computer simulation tends to mean, probably motivated by a desire that we might, if this is true, we could upload ourselves into the cloud and live forever. So we're asked to assign probabilities where we don't have a good idea what those probabilities should be. More importantly, it's not just a trilemma. I think it's a quadrilemma. I'm not even sure if that is a word.
Is that a word?
That is another fundamental assumption in all these ideas that is glossed over. And this is the idea that consciousness is substrate independent, as Bostrom himself puts it in his lovely paper. That it doesn't matter whether brains are made of carbon or silicon. That if you run the right program on a computer of some kind, consciousness will happen. He says this is widely accepted in philosophy of mind and in neuroscience. It is somewhat accepted, but that's also not by everyone, and it's not obvious at all that this is the case. There are some things which, if you simulate them, you bring them about. A computer playing chess actually is playing chess. There are other things that if you simulate them, you just simulate them. You don't actually instantiate them. If you have a simulation of a weather system, it doesn't actually get wet. It's a simulation of a weather system. So where does consciousness lie on this spectrum? I don't actually know, but I'm very suspicious of assuming that it is something that we can simulate. And I'll finish because there's a positive reason to be suspicious of that. Right? We are biological creatures. We're made of neurons. Neurons are made of other things. The other things are made of other things, and so on, all the way down. Where does the substrate start and the other stuff stop? Where does the mindware start and the wetware stop? Where is this substrate that consciousness is supposed to be independent of? In a real computer, we know because that's how they're designed. They're designed so that you can run anything on the hardware. Biological systems are not like that. They're bootstrapped by living processes all the way down. So I'm suspicious of the idea that consciousness is substrate independent. Doesn't mean it isn't. It just means I wouldn't want to rest a massive claim about the nature of the universe on something so uncertain as that.
Interesting. Okay, well, Massimo, your thoughts?
I'm beginning to think that this panel is unbalanced, which I'm fine with because I'm on the majority side. So despite being a philosopher, although my background actually originates in science, I do agree with Sabine and the point that she has made. I also agree with Anil. As a biologist in particular, I think that consciousness is very likely the result of a process of organic biological evolution. And just like any other process of biological evolution, it does require substrates. That doesn't mean that only one particular substrate would do. I will not make a claim that unless it's made of carbon, phosphorus, and so on and so forth, it cannot be conscious. But I will make the comment that the substrate does matter. We can simulate all sorts of other biological processes. One of the famous examples is photosynthesis. We can simulate photosynthesis down to the quantum level. We really know a lot about photosynthesis. But you know, one thing you don't get out of simulated photosynthesis is sugar, which is the only thing that actually matters about photosynthesis. So as Anil said, is consciousness in the same realm as photosynthesis or not? I think that is an open question. But my bet as a biologist is that yes, it is. It's somewhere in that area. The other issue I think that it's interesting to bring up here is the way this first question is phrased, which is exactly how is it possible?
Is the idea that we are living in a computer simulation a real possibility?
Right. Well, what do you mean by real possibility as opposed to a fake possibility? And also, what do we mean by possibility? So I imagine that all sorts of things are possible. Not everything is possible, by the way. We know certain things that are impossible, right? If something violates the laws of physics, it is physically impossible. If something violates logic, it is logically impossible. So not everything is possible. A lot of these arguments about the matrix and similar are actually based not even on possibility, however. They're based on something called conceivability. It is conceivable that, but conceivability is not a parameter that you can actually trust. It just means that you are thinking about something and you think, oh, wouldn't it be cool that if the world worked that way? We have a long history of things that appeared that were conceivable and yet were later on demonstrated to be either physically or logically impossible. Squaring the circle was supposed to be conceivable for centuries, for many centuries, until somebody actually showed mathematically that this is not possible. You just can't do it. So conceivability is really not a good guide toward what we should be interested in or not. Probability is. So if we could get some kind of reasonable estimate of probability, then it would be on a different track. But again, I agree with Anil. I don't think we can. I don't think we have any particular good reason. We can make up stuff. We can say, well, based on subjective Bayesian probability, blah, blah, blah. I think the probability of the matrix is 30%. I'm just making that up. There's no reason to go one way or the other. So that is an important distinction to keep in mind between conceivability, which is no guidance at all, possibility, which is a very vague concept. Sure, all sorts of things are possible, but should we be interested in those? The answer is, well, we should if they're probable. But in this case, I don't think they are.
Okay, well, I want to disclaimer the fact that I didn't write that question to begin with this section. But let's just move on to our next question in that case. So do we think that it is actually reasonable in that case to question the existence of reality? I mean, Sabine, I feel like I'm going to get a blistering response to that. But.
Well, it depends on what you mean by reasonable. If you're a philosopher and you make your living with writing about that kind of thing, it's certainly reasonable to think about it. But if the question is it useful? Do we get anything out of it? I don't see what. I can't really see. If you, as I said, it depends on what you mean by computer simulation, right? If you're comfortable just calling the current laws of nature computer simulation, that's pretty much the end of the discussion. So we can leave it with that. When you're asking about what are the properties of those laws that would have to go on that computer, well, either you're doing theoretical physics, then you have to take it seriously, or you're not doing science and you're not contributing to anything that I find interesting. So I would say it's pretty much useless.
Philosophers take it. I mean, does anyone on the panel want to step in defense of the question?
No, wait, what? Wait. Now, I want to step in, but not in defense necessarily of the question. I think, again, Sabine is right. I don't know about this philosophy thing. As Sabine knows, there are lots of scientists who make a living out of things that are highly questionable and not particularly interesting. But, I mean, to be fair, right? But reasonable is, in fact, a good question. Is it reasonable? And it does depend on what you mean by reason. So, as you pointed out in the introduction, in fact, this question is not new. It doesn't come out of Bostrom or anything like that. At the very least, it goes back to Descartes. So was it reasonable, and he's exercising radical doubt. Basically, he said, once at least in a lifetime, you should wake up and consider that maybe everything you know, it's not actually true. And ask yourself, why the hell do I think that this is true and that is not true? I mean, that's a reasonable exercise. I think that's actually something that once in a while we all ought to do, at least over breakfast, or even better, over a drink. But is it reasonable to spend a lot of time, money, energy, effort, and all that sort of stuff thinking about stuff that does not make any contact, as far as I know, with the empirical? Then there the answer, I think, is no.
Yeah, there might be a useful distinction between reasonableness and usefulness here, I think you're getting to as well. That science in general has done rather well by just making that supposition, that there is an objective reality that is to some extent mind independent, and let's try to figure out what its properties are, how it works. That seems to be a very useful thing to do, but also, it is useful to question the surface appearance of things. In my work as a neuroscientist, you can go a long way by questioning the apparent realism of things as they appear in our perceptual experience. Like colors seem to be part of a mind-independent objective reality, but they aren't. And Newton can tell us that. I mean, you need a brain of a particular kind for such a thing as color to exist. So there is mileage in challenging this basic equation that how things seem is how they are, and the way I perceive the world is how objective reality really is. But of course, that's the business of science, and especially physics, to go underneath the surface appearance of things and figure out what our best predictive explanation of objective reality is.
And that, of course, can produce some rather counterintuitive results. After all, the best model we have of reality is that we literally have a handful of quantum fields where all our particles are just excitations, and actually there are just 5 fundamentally enormously big, complicated things interacting in some kind of Hilbert space. That's worse than the matrix in some sense. It's even weirder. And yet I think we would say, Sabine of course can correct me on getting the physics really straight and right, but that picture is very different, and the surface reality we see is kind of an unfolding of some deeper things going on which are quite frankly very, very dissimilar from our normal experience, and indeed make a computer simulation of Earth run by some teenager in his basement look downright normal. So I think there is something very important about doing these mind stretches and trying to figure out reality. But I think also there is this important question, is it even a dangerous idea to think that reality isn't real? Because in practice, of course, the real question for practically any piece of information you get is, so what? How should I change my life given that I got this piece of information? So as long as I'm not getting information that I actually am in a simulation, I just have this vague suspicion that maybe I could be, that doesn't seem to change anything I should be doing. If I were suddenly told by a giant pop-up window across the sky, yes, Anders, you are in a simulation, that might still actually not change things very much, except if it says, and it will shut down in 5 minutes, in which case, of course, I will immediately rush off to the tent and get me some wine or something. Then I actually
you might rush off to a psychiatrist.
That might also be a reasonable thing to do.
That would be it, right?
Yeah. And given kind of my probabilities and credences, maybe I should probably first start with a quick check-in with the psychiatrist. Did you see that pop-up window up there? Okay, let's have a wine together.
That's interesting.
I mean, I guess it's jumping ahead a little bit, but I think there's an important point there, like what difference does it make? And you said, in everyday life, if I'm going to have a glass of water, which is too far away, then I can't then it doesn't make any difference at all, right? This is a very subtle way of asking for a glass of water.
I got that. What is the reality of this?
But there is a way it might make a difference, and it's a sort of more overarching way that the world is basically on fire, as we know, and if we have this high-level belief that it's a simulation, and that there may be many other simulations running, and that some adolescent, far distant teenager can just reset it and start again, we may run the risk of just taking what's actually happening around us a little less seriously.
And this has actually been an important historical thing, not with the simulation argument, but Thomas Moynihan, and his historian of ideas, wrote this definitive work on looking at existential risk. And the idea that we could go extinct as a species and this would be a very bad thing is surprisingly recent. It only became kind of thinkable in the 20th century. And one of the big reasons why people before didn't take it very seriously was this idea that, oh, there's always going to be people in other times, in other places. Of course, there are going to be people on Jupiter. And Kant famously argued that God would not create planets that wouldn't have any inhabitants. There would be always a kind of a backup everywhere. And that actually acted very much against the urgency we feel like, oh no, we might be the only planet with life and intelligence in the universe, and we might not be handling it very well. That gives us a tremendous responsibility if we think we're alone.
But wait a minute. Hold on. So, first of all, responsibility to whom? If we're the only ones here in the universe, which I don't think, but let's say that for the sake of argument we are, who are we responsible to? Once we're gone, that's it, done. So there's no...
We might still be responsible to ourselves and the preferences we have about the future and what our ancestors wanted.
But if I'm gone, I'm not responsible anymore. While I'm alive, I'm responsible, but after I'm gone, that's it. But I want to question a couple of your assumptions there. First of all, I don't think it's true that we have started considering our own extinction only recently. Put in those terms, yes. But, you know, Christians have believed for thousands of years that at some point the world is going to end as we know it.
But they believed it was a meaningful end, not the end of meaning.
Well, if this is really a simulation, then there is some meaning, right? The guys running a simulation can start it over and so on and so forth.
Well, that might depend very much about the intentions of the people making the simulation. And even if it turns out that they want, and even if the meaning is that they want to test the, let's say, the healthcare allocation in the NHS, we might say, we simulated people actually want to enjoy life, we want to have love and do other things. We might actually not care about your meaning, we care about our meaning.
Absolutely. But you see where I'm going there. People have raised the issue that the whole notion of a simulation matrix, et cetera, is essentially a secular religion. It's really not that different from the Christian belief.
But where does that lead us?
Nowhere, just like the Christian belief.
Anil, Sabine, I mean, how do you feel about this conversation?
Well, I think it's certainly true that it's very similar to a type of religion, and you could ask exactly the same question about more standard religions like Christianity. What difference does it actually make? But it does, as a matter of fact, make a difference to a lot of people. So I have some sympathy for that. So as long as people understand it's just a belief, that's fine with me. I get a problem if they make statements about physics.
And I think that's also an interesting issue. What should we even look for? You said earlier that, well, we see the symmetries of physics doesn't fit with a simulation. I'd slightly disagree with what you said there. Because, for example, I seem to remember that you argued that Lorentz invariance means that, okay, we don't have any voxels in the simulation, which is totally true, but you can make a simulation that has Lorentz invariance. So you could always get around by saying, well, maybe we haven't seen a sign of that kind of bug. But the problem, and this is of course where things move into conceptual possibility, is always, well, it may be a different kind of simulation. It's very annoying because you can never disprove it, which is of course why the ghost of Karl Popper is kind of hovering around here and say, how do you falsify this belief?
Yeah, but look, you just made a big statement about the laws of nature. We can just make a simulation that is Lorentz invariant. Can you actually do this on a computer that proceeds in discrete time steps and actually reproduce all the observations that we have? That's a pretty big claim.
Yeah. But that one is something we can get in front of a whiteboard or a computer and actually start demonstrating or testing.
I mean, that got very nerdy very fast, didn't it?
Yeah.
I wanted to actually, maybe this is just me, but at this point in the conversation, I'm starting to wonder, what is reality? Can we just touch back on that? Because I feel like there was a bit of a division between the sort of, you mentioned it yourself as well, this sort of objective reality and almost like a maybe perceived reality, and there's sort of a distinction between those things maybe. Am I right to sort of feel that?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And I think there is this, I've previously, building on the language of others, described perception as a kind of controlled hallucination, which is often misunderstood as the claim that there is no objective reality out there, it's all made up. And of course, the controlled is equally as important as the hallucination here. What I'm trying to emphasize there is that the way we experience the world is an internal construction generated by our brains and bodies, but it is of course not independent of what's actually out there. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing a very good job of staying alive. Evolution has designed our perceptual systems to perceive things in ways that are useful for our continued existence, that help us stay alive, basically. And what we perceive, just again, a very basic example of color, is both less than and more than whatever objective reality might be described as a sort of mind-independent thing. We know the photoreceptors in our eyes are only sensitive to 3 wavelengths out of the whole electromagnetic spectrum. So it's less than, but then we experience a whole universe of colors. So in that sense, it's more than. That universe of colors doesn't exist in the electromagnetic spectrum, only as a potential when it's interacting with something else. So there is this, I think, very important distinction in asking, on the one hand, and this is sort of more the purview of neuroscience and psychology, what is the relationship between our perceptual experience and the causes of that perceptual experience in the world, and then more the purview of physics, how best to describe those causes at the most fundamental level.
There's a long tradition in philosophy of non-radical skepticism. There is the radical skepticism, right? And it goes back even way before Descartes, Pyrrhus, back in ancient Greece. But at about the same time as Pyrrhus, there were non-radical skeptics, sometimes referred to as academic skeptics, because they temporarily took over Plato's academy after Plato died. And one of those was Cicero, who incidentally invented the word probability. It comes from the Latin probabilis. And that was exactly his point. He was saying, look, reality is very likely out there. We don't know how to access reality directly. We can only make probable statements on the basis of our understanding and perception. And that's really all we have. We don't have direct access to reality, whatever that is. So I don't know that there is actually an answer to the question of what reality is.
But that's a very interesting genealogy there, because you basically, and then you go through Kant as well and so on.
Yep.
And basically, the claim now is that it's not only that us as people with rational thoughts make statements of that sort. That's basically what the brain is doing in the business of perception as well. The brain is figuring out the most probable perceptual statements about objective reality, and that's what we experience.
And we know that the brain can be wrong.
Yeah.
Or in fact make up stuff, right? I have a blind spot, I know, because I can show to myself the blind spot if I'm very careful. But normally I don't perceive it. I run around and it's like it's all continuous. My brain is making up stuff, literally perceptions that are not there.
I'm a little worried about that, because this idea of being wrong and making up stuff and filling in, it sort of suggests there would be a completely accurate way of perceiving objective reality if only the brain didn't have it. But that's not the case. It's like it's all a construction. There is no criterion of absolute veridicality there.
Right. No, I think the claim is only that the brain could be doing better. Like I could have no blind spots. There are animals that don't have blind spots because as a result of evolution, the reason we have blind spots is because evolution is a quirky thing, and at some point our blood vessels got twisted around, our nerves, optical nerve got twisted around and attached in a particular way. Octopuses don't have that, so they don't have blind spots. So it could be done better. That doesn't mean that they have access to reality as it is.
That's interesting. I mean, what I'm hearing, I'm a scientist actually, I should have declared my affiliation at the start of this
Not a philosopher.
But I'm not a philosopher.
Good.
No, but what I heard in what you were saying actually was, we aren't able to access reality directly, but we have generated a methodology that we call science, which we use to sort of gauge that reality. Would that be fair to say, do we think? She's going to get out-scientised by the other scientists on the panel.
Well, I think it's very unlikely that we're going to answer the question, what is reality, in the limited amount of time that we have. I think for what working scientists are concerned, it's just a useful construct that we apply to our theories. And I mean, it's certainly in agreement with what we observe, that a lot of what we observe doesn't really care a lot about us, right? And I think that's the reason why we find it useful to think of an external reality that exists independent of us. Does it mean that it actually exists? Well, we can never be quite sure, right?
I mean, that leads me on to my third and final question, which is, are we just victims to Hollywood fantasy? Does anyone want to jump in with that?
For me, it's funny that this is called Lost in the Matrix, because the Matrix is actually not like the simulation hypothesis at all, right? So the whole premise of the Matrix, and I'm hoping the fourth instantiation of it, is non-shit. I mean, I'm really hoping,
that is a bold statement.
But, the premise of the Matrix is there are real brains that are in some sort of factory farm environment being milked for their power. And really, the experience that people like Neo and all the characters in the Matrix have is it's more the brain in the vat experiment, that their brain activity has been manipulated in particular ways so that they have this experience of the real world. That's a very, very different claim to the claim that the universe is in fact a computer simulation and we are all characters within that computer simulation.
Way, I love the first movie, but it's a really horrible premise. Human brains generate so little power that these robots are just crazy if they think they can run things off of human brain, but whatever.
Yeah,
it's true.
There are other movies that are getting closer to this, like 13th Floor, which I think is decent, but didn't have that visual appeal, etc. And I find it interesting because stories that your reality isn't real, they are relatively recent. Certainly there are a lot of stories where people are recounting things that turn out to be dreams, which is a good way for the author to say that, okay, I'm actually not claiming that I actually went to the moon or that these things happen. But then gradually you get to Alice in Wonderland, where it's actually being played around with. Of course, the author was a logician and was kind of happy to do recursive stories, stories within stories, playing around with the weird metaphysical possibilities that happen if you happen to be a dream about being inside a chess game, etc. And gradually we have matured, I think, when it comes to storytelling. We have actually learned to accept that stories within stories or simulated worlds are part of the paraphernalia we might use in our thinking. And I think that is in itself an interesting part, because we use these kind of images of the future, images of possibilities to reason about other things. When bringing up the risks of artificial intelligence, typically all of us in that debate groan whenever somebody brings up the Terminator. But it's a standard picture, slowly being nudged out by Ava from Ex Machina, fortunately, but it's still kind of these standard pictures we use for good and ill. And I think the ability to think that, well, what if this was like the Matrix or 13th Floor, is a useful way of reasoning about many other things. Because I do think the Matrix movies got something right. Many people feel a weird sense of unreality. There is this unrequited love from the Wachowskis to Baudrillard. Many of us probably feel that when we're spending our days kind of going through social media, where half of our Twitter followers are probably bots in some farm pretending to be humans for various nefarious political purposes.
Speak for yourself, Anders.
Well, I would say maybe the notion of stories in the way we now are talking about it is recent. But again, the use of made-up scenarios and interesting stories to make a point, an important point, or a philosophical or scientific point, it's actually very old. Again, at the very least, it goes back to Plato. I mean, his image of the cave, for instance, is one. He made up a bunch of myths like Atlantis. I'm sorry if you didn't know that Atlantis is a myth. Spoiler alert. Right. So storytelling is important. So I don't think we're necessarily victims of Hollywood, except in the fact that typically Hollywood stories are badly written, and not particularly interesting. But The Matrix was an exception, the first one, precisely because it was well thought out, almost, and well written. I also wanted to add one more thing. The fact that Elon Musk supports the idea, it's a good reason not to believe it.
But Elon actually has a reasonable reason to think it. Imagine waking up and realize, wait a minute, I'm a billionaire with a space program and stuff like that. What's the likelihood that I'm not in a computer game?
I'm sorry. I don't know Musk personally, but I follow him on Twitter. And unless he's a bot, that psychological description does not even begin to actually match with the reality. I think he knows perfectly well why he's a billionaire.
Fascinating stuff. I mean, yeah, I think you do raise a really interesting point actually about the role of sort of storytelling, literature in modern day times, obviously film increasingly. in sort of thought experiment, basically, isn't it? That's what it is. It's somebody thinking, being told a sort of scientific fact or a possibility or a theory, and then creating an art piece, basically, to engage with that.
But wait, thought experiments, great. So thought experiments are very important both in philosophy and in science, but they become relevant when they actually touch on the empirical, right? So we have famous thought experiments in science. Einstein imagining that he was, on a light wave. Galileo dropping stuff from the Tower of Pisa, which he never actually did. That sort of stuff. But the reason those are important is because at some point they made contact with reality, with the empirical. People could actually use those thought experiments to do real experiments and to advance our knowledge of the world such as it is. This one doesn't strike me as one of those.
But it does touch on the consistency of our beliefs. Basically, that trilemma or that quadrilemma shows that there is something wrong here. Something in the reasoning that led us up to this situation is really wonky. And that is useful to know. Then we might say, okay, I totally believe that that one is not plausible at all, or this tension, we can investigate that. We can get in front of a whiteboard and try to see if I can make a model that shows the right kind of local symmetries. We can get over to the questions about, wait a minute, credibility and plausibility and possibility here. Maybe that is actually breaking the argument, but notice that these things are internal in some sense to the philosophical thing. It doesn't tell us that much about whether this reality is actually simulated. For that, we need to look for pop-up windows or some weird bug in physics.
I mean, that leads me on to the burning question that I have. I don't know about any of you right now, but like, what would it take to prove that? Like, how are we going to prove if we are or aren't in a simulation?
Well, proof is a very high standard. I think it's better less to math. We can't really prove a lot. But having empirical evidence of something, that might be a good starting point. And I mean, in that case, the burden of proof or evidence is squarely on his shoulders.
Yeah. Here is an interesting possibility that a friend of mine suggested. Suppose we go out into space and finally meet aliens, and they turn out to be a real advanced super civilization, and they are running zillions and zillions of ancestor simulations of their own ancestors in order to find out some weird alien questions about history. That seems to be the kind of evidence that would change our plausibilities a bit, because we know at least that looks like they, for some reason, are able to do. Then maybe we are simulated.
You want to try getting a grant for that?
Yes, first we need a space program.
Especially a 5-year grant.
Yeah, might need a.
Yeah. Very happy to do it.
Well, I think it's. I mean, I think it is a little. It's a little much to ask of it to come up with proof or evidence. It doesn't seem the kind of thing that evidence can bear on in a useful way, at least in the near-term horizon. I do think the value of it, in as much as there is in just probing some of the natural sort of rivers of thinking that we tend to apply. Ultimately, I still think there's great reason to be skeptical of both the argument. So we should distinguish as well the argument, which is this trilemma or quadrilemma, from the hypothesis that this is actually the case. And even, I think, Bostrom, you will know better, is uncommitted to the hypothesis but committed to the argument. It is useful in how it changes assumptions we might otherwise make. And actually, when I was thinking about this just now, so one of the reasons I'm suspicious of it is this assumption that consciousness is substrate independent. Right? So you could actually turn it the other way around. This is probably really bad philosophy, but you could turn it the other way around and say, okay, this is actually the simulation argument is a very good argument against functionalism, because if functionalism is true, then the simulation argument might follow, and that seems bonkers, so let's not do that. But that's not good. But I do think it's useful how it changes the way we think.
I like it.
I don't think bonkers doesn't necessarily mean that the argument is wrong.
But it's interesting you mentioned that Bostrom is committed to the argument, but not to the hypothesis, right? That strikes me as suspicious. Right. I mean, if I think that an argument is really good, then I'm committed to
well, no, the argument is that there are these three, and I think now 4 possibilities, the 4th possibility being that consciousness is not substrate independent.
Right.
And the argument is simply that one of those things has to apply.
So, for example, he's very committed to trying to reduce existential risk, because if you agree with the argument, that seems that you need maybe to assign more probability than you normally would to the possibility that we might be doomed, and maybe we should do something about that. So you can take the other horn and say, oh, we really, really need to reduce nukes.
But that's bizarre. If I were really convinced that all I am, that the reality is a computer simulation, probably run by a kid who doesn't have anything else to do in the afternoon, why would I care about my existential risk?
Yeah, but that is, when I've chosen one of the other horns of the trilemma. You can also say that the first horn is, it's very likely that we are going to be in trouble and never simulate the past. So in that case, the urgency of fixing existential risk goes up. Or you might end up with the second one. Oh, future post-humans are going to be really well-coordinated and moral. That's a really odd thought. How would we ever get up there?
Have we decided that we are or we aren't? I mean, where we are with this?
I don't know.
We don't know.
I'm waiting for the pop-up window.
I'm just, yeah. I mean, I think we might be waiting a while, right, before something that obvious turns up.
Yeah, I just think there's very little credence to assign to that belief. And so in a sense, it doesn't much matter whether the argument stands as an argument. It's just very, very unlikely.
On that note, I'm really sorry, everybody. I have to thank the speakers. If you'd like to join your hands and clapping for the wonderful speakers.
Podcasts, talks, debates, courses and articles. Visit the Institute of Art and Ideas.